Welcome.
Okay. We are live, so go. Thank you.
Presentation in HCL, and I've originally worked on this product since 2002, first in Germany and the last few years in the US. And I also transferred 2 years ago when the product was sold from IBM to HCL as well. We're going to talk about recent features that we delivered in the core area, and I'll go through a list of different things we added. All of these, of course, are documented in the info center or will be documented if they're not available yet, and you can look up them later. So maybe first, this part here. We have a recent change coming up in our naming. So far you might be aware that for our container releases, we were shipping numbers in between, for instance, 191, or recently we shipped 194, and we have 195 coming up this month. But we're planning to make a naming change and also change the way we deliver the software. So you could see that we had quite a bit of break in between CF18 and CF19 and CF19 and CF196. In the future, our goal is to deliver those together. This will make both the life of hybrid easier if you have a hybrid deployment where you have an on-premise DX core and connecting to the containers in the cloud. So we're thinking that roughly every 6 weeks, we will be delivering the software on both for containers as well as for on-premise, and hopefully that will also clear up some confusion some of our customers had, especially if they're in the hybrid area, like for instance, does 191 work with 19, or do I have to stay with 19? So that will help with customers going forward, hopefully. And also, if you have any questions in the session, please feel free to ask. With that, we're going to talk about some of the APIs we added, and I tried to, on the slides here, on the top-hand side, you can see which CF this became available. That's also one of the reasons why I added the numbering scheme, because maybe you were looking for CF20, but actually the next one is going to be CF196. So we had a whole bunch of APIs that we added for WCM so that you can do operations directly via the APIs that in the past you might have had to do only via the user interface, or maybe you had to write some Java APIs to do this. So now it's possible to do this via REST. So the first one here is apply the content template API. For folks that might not be aware, we have a content template in WCM, right? And the content is based upon that content template. Now, what happens when you modify the content template? Let's say you add a field or you remove a field. You can then use this API, the JSON here, to send it to then get automatically all of the content updated with the according parameters, and those parameters basically map what the original parameters were here as well. And as I mentioned, any questions, just jump in. Then the details of the content template. So far, it was not possible to find out, for instance, for a content template, if there was any kind of limits or configurations done in the offering template. So for instance, you can have a minimum or maximum size of characters or words and so on. And if you ever had to write some kind of custom UI, if you think about content as a service, you were not able to retrieve that, and then the user might enter too much data and it might fail on the server. Would of course be much nicer on the client to show the user how much he can actually enter. Then the next API we added is related to the process now and the remove workflow APIs. You might be aware that you can set a future time for when a content is going to be published, right? So let's say you set your content to be published in August, but then in the UI, it was already possible to immediately publish it. If you change your mind, you're like, well, maybe this document is valid already earlier than later, and I want to process that now. In that case, I can trigger this via this REST API now as well. And similar to that, if I have an item that's following a workflow and maybe I don't need the workflow on this item, I can trigger that as well. Then we also added a comment API. So you might be aware that you can, when you approve an item or go through the workflow steps, that you can add comments to content. And those comments appear here in the offering portlet. They're also shown in the content composer. And we have this new API where you can also leave comments on an item. What is somewhat special about this API is that even if you're on a workflow step that does not require a comment, you can now leave comments. So you can stack them up here and add whatever you want to add to it as you go. Another ability is the ability to lock and unlock an item. That was so far not possible via the REST API, so we added that. The idea behind locking, unlocking is that typically when you're active with an item and you've made a bunch of changes, we lock the item for you if you're on the UI, so that nobody else will possibly override while you're working on it. But as an administrator, you can enforce an unlock because maybe somebody is just stuck there, or maybe whatever that person is doing is not important enough. Whatever you're doing is more important, and you want to go ahead with that. So we have those APIs available as well. We also enhanced the query API. So you might be familiar with the WCM query API. That's actually really powerful REST API. So you can filter for content, for instance, by type, by text, by name, by whatever you basically want to filter on. And we recently added an additional set of parameters that you can pass in. Among these is title and name, like ignore case. In this case, if you, for instance, want to look up something independent of the case of the letters, right? So uppercase, lowercase, you can use those parameters. And we also have a parameter title or name like. So if you don't want to do two separate searches for a title and the name, you can combine it with a single parameter. And then we also expose the JCR text search. So you might be aware that with JCR text search, right, you can search for anything within content itself. So for instance, let's say you had all of your content and it was referencing IBM, and you recently got by accident moved to HCL, right? And now you have to replace everything that currently has IBM with HCL. So in that case, you could use our new text contains or text contains exact to find out where is HCL or IBM being found. And then after I find this content, I can then update it from REST as well. Another parameter I recently added was the filter access. The idea here is that you can, for instance, find content under a certain parent or of a certain type that you have editor or manager access to. So if you write your own UI, right, or you want to show some kind of options in a content as a service UI, you might want to check based on the access when you filter based on the search and the query. Any questions? People familiar with the query API?
I have a more general one, Thomas. All those new and old REST API, do we have an open API descriptor for those, or something like a Swagger interface, or those are just documented the old way? My question is more about building a client for it. So if we have the spec, that would be somehow easier. What's the status of those?
So this time they're only documented in the info center. We don't have a Swagger at this time for it, but we actually have something coming up. Obviously, for legal reasons, we cannot commit to it, but we are working on an enhanced WCM API that also will have a Swagger with it, and that Swagger will be living on DX as well. And while we're doing that, we're also looking at all of our existing APIs to see if we can add Swagger for that as well. It's definitely technically possible. It's just like some effort, and we need to prioritize it. But if you're interested in that and you feel that's important, let us know, and we can also take that forward.
Thank you. By the way, the new APIs are very good.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. An additional one that we added. I have an echo. All right, we'll keep on going. I think now it's done. So for syndication and subscription, we have a new API that lets you manage that. You can stop and start syndicate on subscriber, and you might have had a session in the past where we exposed or are exposing a similar capability with DX client that basically under the covers uses some of this API functionality as well. And we can also find the status to see what status the syndication is in. Reason for this API is some of our customers like to stop and start syndication as needed. And this gives you the ability to plug that into Jenkins or something else, or of course also just to find out what is the status of it. We also added a bunch of multilingual APIs, you can find the configuration of MLS, and then we also have the ability to get translation and to update translations. And we'll see a little bit more on that later on, how that's going to be exposed with DX client. But the idea here is that you can basically find all translations or content, and you might be or not be aware that the commerce integration with DX, right, the new commerce integration, is actually using this under the covers. So they actually already use our API to find the translation for the different languages that they ship the out-of-the-box store with, and it actually finds then the right language to render. And then the idea behind the put is that you can update the translations for an item. We also added the ability to find portlet references. So this might be of interest where, since we don't have referential integrity between content and portlets, right? I mean, you guys are familiar that in the WCM portlets, you can reference, or typically you configure the content that you're going to display, unless you have the page mapped to it. Now, sometimes if you're like, well, can I delete this content or not? I might want to find out, are there any references from pages to that kind of content? And we added an API that allows you to find these references. Currently, what it prints out is the OID of the page, the portlet instance object ID, and the title of the page. Then the next one is we added an API to find deleted items. So you are familiar that when you delete an item in WCM, it's not really deleted, right? It's just in the trash bucket, and then you can decide to purge that item or restore it. We now have an API here where you can find the deleted items, if there are any, and then you can either purge them or you can also restore them with the APIs, with the REST APIs. Another API that we added is the ability to invalidate the theme cache. And you might be familiar with that from the theme analyzer. There's a button here where you can invalidate the theme cache. That's typically relevant if you're like making some updates, let's say web app, and you had a longer running cache and the data is not showing up yet, or maybe you messed with the file system itself. Like if you have a JSP-based theme and you made some modifications to some HTML file that's referenced by the JSP or in one of the active or non-active content spots. Now you can also trigger the invalidation of the cache from an API, so that if, let's say, you're deploying your theme, you can also afterwards invalidate the cache. We looked at this one, the translation. So any question on the APIs before I move on to the next feature?
I suggest everybody take the opportunity for questions, or maybe we have the questions at the end because it's so much stuff to digest. So we let people having their brain run, and we catch up with questions at the end. Okay, thank you. Please.
All right, we'll keep on moving. So one of the other features that we recently implemented is the ability to have the locale in the URL. And the idea here is basically when you want to be both SEO friendly and you want to have a different language tag and a friendly URL, the challenge is that currently the solutions that we had was that you either encode the locale into the URL, what makes it unfriendly, or you can add a query parameter at the end, what is not very SEO friendly, although the URL is friendly in itself, or you could possibly create a different label for each of the languages and have different content. But that would mean that you have to duplicate all the content in the pages, what can be then a pain when you have to make changes. So our new solution that we added, it is possible now to configure the languages as part of the URL. And all of the other functionality works as before. So we do not modify any of the URLs unless you want to. So we insert the URLs. The ones that are affected is WPS Portal, WPS My Portal, and the content handler URLs. This works with friendly URLs. This works in the context of WCM MLS. The ones that I did not work on was WAB because those should be separate anyway. And also the WCM REST I didn't adjust because that's typically nothing that you use during active rendering. And we can see if maybe we're lucky enough that authentication worked, and I can actually show something here in my demo since I switched over. We might be in luck here. So we don't actually have to be authenticated. We can actually directly Windows. So I can switch over here. So I enabled a set of languages, and you can configure for which languages you want this. For instance, here I can add DE into it. And as you can see now, the top here is translated into German. And if I keep on traversing with my system, you can see that Elevate always stays intact. So I can go anywhere within the portal and we keep the language intact. We also keep this intact and we find the right language for MLS, but also in our out-of-the-box switcher that we added here, right? If I switch, for instance, for Spanish, you can see that ES now shows up. So I can trigger that also via the regular APIs to change the language. And of course, everything else works. So you can see the translation here of our different content. And in case you have a certain language that you don't want the URL, in this case, I did not enable this feature for French. If I switch to French, you can now see that there is no FR or similar being displayed, but the URL is basically getting unfriendly. So this is one of the upcoming features of 196. If you're on containers, you can already use it with 193.
I have a question. Can this multi-language capability be set per virtual portal? So I can have one virtual portal with a set of languages and another one with another one.
No, it's not specific virtual portal, but you don't have to use it, right? So the existing URLs work as before. So if you don't expose /es or /en or whatever, right, it would not automatically be rendered that way. So you have control over what you want to expose or not expose.
Okay, so URL generation is using the new prefix only if I'm calling it with the new prefix.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Sure. There's no questions on the friendly locales. So we'll switch to the content security policy feature. Content security policy is a new security feature that was introduced in the browser world, and pretty much all of the browsers support this now. The idea here is it provides a defense against cross-site scripting. And basically, the server is supposed to send a header back. And in that header, it defines the allowed list of resources that can load externally or even internally. And any kind of violations would be prevented from being loaded. And you can also tell it like what's allowed and what's not allowed. So what we added here is a CSP filter. What the CSP filter does, it does a rewrite, and we also fixed all of our out-of-the-box references for the regular rendering modes. This is really meant for customer rendering, right? It's not really meant for like internal editing or things like that. It's more like when you serve the external side to your external customers or internal customers. So you can configure CSP, and you can configure that per page. There is a report mode as well, so it will tell you in case something is not working. So let's see if we can also take a little demo on that. So I added this. As mentioned, there's a metadata you can set on the page. I did not enable this for Bootburn. I enabled this on the home area. If we look at the inspect here and we check out the network, let's refresh this again here. And if we look at the request, and we look at the headers of the request in the response, we can see the content security policy. In this case, it's the report only. And it tells itself that it can load itself, and it can load, meaning the HTML, and it can load the scripts only if they have the nouns attached to the script itself. The same holds true for styles. Now, if we look at the markup here, right? So if we take a look at the source here, and we look for any kind of style tag, the style will be added with the nouns. So for instance, here we can see the nouns coming back for this particular style tag. And that's why the browser actually allows the execution of it. So there is a public service for getting these nouns when the request is happening. So if you have your own code that's executing where you need the nouns, you can get it for that particular request. So this changes per request. And this is becoming more and more requirement, especially for public side or government sites. So it could be of interest for you. That was discussion on CSP security feature. Any questions on the CSP security feature, or I'll move on? All right. Next thing I'm going to show is progressive web apps. That's a feature we added with CF19. So the PWA, progressive application, is a feature where you can basically provide an app with your HTML. And it can be installed on any kind of device. Like what's somewhat cool or an advantage over maybe native applications is that this app can work on Windows, this app can work on Mac, this app can work on pretty much even Chromebooks. So you don't have to write any specific code. Also what it does is it allows you to do offline capability, and you can configure how that works. So you can say for which pages you want the capability to work and install. There is the ability to work in a preview mode. It also loads pretty quickly. So let's see if we can get this to work nicely here. I don't have the URL here. Give me 1 second because I'm on a different machine. And the reason why I'm going to a different machine is because this requires a valid certificate. So you cannot do this this work if you have an invalid certificate. And so you can get this going. Yes. People like this demo. I can also take a look at the default. When we are on the Woodburn page, right, we also added the ability to install the app, so I can't get to the machine here. All right, here we go. All right, so here we have the Get App button. So you can also implement this in your own way, and the same also appears here in the browser. And if I would be on iOS or on Android, I get the same install button. And now I switch to Windows, right? The same exists on Mac, so I can install this app now. And as you can see now, I have my app available, and it shows in a responsive fashion. Of course, I could have it bigger or smaller as well. You can also influence how often this updates or which pages are prefetched, so that when I'm online, I'm browsing these different sites, that they still work when I'm not active on the system. So if we do an inspect here, and let's go offline for a second. Network. And I want to go offline. And I want to jump back. You can see that even though I'm offline, so none of these are actually going to the server. They are all cached locally because the prefetching already loaded my pages. And I can also go back to the home page and none of these requests go back to the server. So you can relatively easily here have an app running without much effort, can have your DX site available and be used by offline users. Maybe they want to take some notes, or maybe they just want to browse your website while it's not available, and install an app on any device. Any questions on PWA? All right, next one I'm going to take a look at is the theme editor. It's something that we added with CF 193, and then on premise it's available with 196. So if you have a web dev theme, we want to make that easy to edit it from the browser as well. Of course, you could just use web dev and edit it as well, but some of our customers like to just have the ability to modify the theme. So inside the theme manager, I can go here and edit on my particular theme. So let's again see if we can get the demo rolling here. We'll switch back to use latest and go to themes. And we can hit the edit button. And now I can see all the contributions and other sites, and I can make modifications as I go to my static site. And save it, and it will immediately be visible. All right, any questions on the theme editor? All right, next one I'm going to take a look at is the mobile preview. So the mobile preview was added, we added it to the out-of-the-box themes. It can, of course, be added to a custom theme as well. The idea here is that while you're editing your site, you can relatively easily, without having to use a user agent switcher or some kind of browser tooling, you can open another tab that shows you how your site would look like in the according URL. So let's take a look at that in a quick demo as well. We'll switch back to Woodburn and we'll launch it here. And as you can see now, I can see that on certain devices, and I can add additional devices as I go. So maybe I want to add my iPad as well. Now you can see on how this would look like in the according browsers, and I can even make changes to it. I can also navigate around on the site to look at different pages as I go. So you know, that's how now I have products, and here I can have an exhibition, so I can have the same page as I go. And I can rotate this as well, because as we know, people might be rotating this, and just to ensure that my site looks accordingly as I like. I can save this as well, allow some user agent switching or scale the devices as well. So makes it easy to work on my site and see how it would look like in a mobile without necessarily always having those available. All right, any questions on mobile preview? Okay. Next feature I'm going to talk about is the WCM Advanced Cache Flash. So you might be aware that the cache configuration for WCM, right? You can enable the so-called advanced cache. And while all of the other caches outside of the advanced and the fragment cache are updated when a change happens, meaning when syndication happens to the target system and content is being updated, the data will become visible, right? For the other caches, this particular cache is time-based. And until the actual update happens, you might not see your update. What we kept on adding here is the ability to flush that particular part of the cache that has changed. And when you enable this feature and the properties are configured there on the right-hand side, you can see them. When syndication or when kind of content change happens, we flush the particular part of the cache. This handles the vast majority of items. There is some complexity. So if you have a menu that iterates over items, while we will find out if there's additional less entries, we will not necessarily flush all of those as well. But at least for single items, this was our first step at flushing those single items out to make them better visible and do not have necessary to wait until the cache is fully flushed. Any questions on the advanced flush cache? Otherwise, I'll keep on moving. So you might be aware that with CF18, we added the WCM support tools out of the box, and we'll take a quick look at this while adding the demo here. So let's jump over. And this was added for both the Practitioner Studio theme as well as for the classic admin theme as well. So we have the WCM support tools available here, and all of the things that you're used to, like browsing the nodes in the JCR, right? Meaning you can look at how the different content is being stored inside the workspace. So in this case, JCR stands for Java Content Repository, and the web content, PZN rules, WebDAV, and a few other things are stored in it. And I can browse what is actually living inside my site. And I can also look for UUIDs, particularly helpful if I'm debugging some kind of syndication challenges or other problems that I have in the log and I want to find a particular item. So this is available out of the box since CF18 for you. You don't have to download this tool separately and install it. The next feature I'm going to talk about is import-export of content translations with DX Client. And I think Sharika a few weeks back presented on all the cool things that DX Client gives you. If you're not familiar with it, it's a node-based tool that allows you to run a bunch of operations against DX, like deploying a portlet or running XML access or restarting your portal even, or similar things. And one of the latest additions is the export import, and that is using the APIs that I talked about pretty much at the beginning in regards to MLS. So this requires that MLS is configured for your system. And basically what is happening is that the DX client goes against those APIs to export the content. You can export the content of all libraries or of a certain set of libraries, and it writes those into the CSV file in a certain format. The format that we come up with was discussed with some translation providers. So we researched the market first to see what translation providers where you might want to send this CSV file to for translation would accept. So in this case here, we see a little sample at the bottom here, where we have a piece of content, and the piece of content is an element inside the content. The field name is, for in this case, visitor name. And we have the source, in this case, English, is Mandersmitzen, the targets in Mandersmitzen. And you could translate this, in this case, maybe translate in the name does not make too much sense, but maybe you want to translate it if you're in Chinese into different characters, right? And send that back in. So of course, that's possible. You get the export, you can hand that external to customers or translation providers, or maybe you have somebody in-house that does not want to have to go through all of the content WCM. They can just get this CSV file, translate it for you, you re-import it, and you have your content translated. All right, there's no questions on the MLS. I'm gonna jump to the JSF bridge. So JSF, Java Server Faces, are a feature that is supported by the Web Application Server. Now, if you want to use portlets with JSF, you had to use a JSF bridge. What actually happens under the covers? Like you might not have been aware of what's actually going on under the covers. But the JSF portlet bridge was transferred from IBM to HCL as well. And we provided a later portlet bridge. This only happens if you're on a version higher than 855X or 905X. Before that, the portlet bridge is still the IBM one. We automatically update the portlet bridge for you when you apply CF18, CF19, or later fix pack, and we detect that the WAS version is higher than the one where the JSF bridge was removed, we provide full support for JSF 2.0. There is also a large set of features for JSF 2.2 that are part of the bridge, but we have not implemented 100% of those features. So if you're interested in 2.2, we might not hit 100% there, but if you need details, we can also provide those as needed. There's a little bit in the other category I'm going to talk about. We recently added a feature, and this will also be available with 196 for both containers and non-containers, is a simplification of the course configuration for DX. Now, I'm assuming that most folks are familiar with CORS. It's basically a security mechanism of the browser or of the web that will prevent calling external URLs unless those external URLs define that they can be called by the origin of the caller. Now, if you have a use case where you want to call DX with according CORS, right? So far, unless it's configured, we might prevent you from making that external REST call to DX. And so far, what you had to do is you had to modify the web XML to allow that CORS configuration being called. With 196, it's possible to just add this to WP config service, and you can add the configuration there with the methods, the max age, which headers are allowed, and which headers are being exposed. That is pretty much it for slides that I had prepared on features that we have recently done in the Portal WCM core area. Of course, there's more to come. If you are on premise, 196 is the one that will have a lot of these features, but as mentioned, I have added like little headers to most of the features to see that depending on which CF you're currently on or which container release you're on, in which one was that originally exposed. And you might be aware that everything is cumulative. So if you're on CF19, of course, everything that was listed for CF18 is included as well. With that, I guess we can take more questions.
Okay, I will. Sorry, I want to stop recording, so we typically have the Q&A session as private, so you can ask anything.